I'll be honest, when I went on interviews back then, the biggest thought in my mind was, "Oh, can I get away with people not realizing I have a disability?" And it sounds terrible, and it makes me really think about disabled folks trying to move through different industries with that kind of obstacle in the way. But Wilshire's been great. It's been great. But yeah, you just make it work, whatever you need to do. But like I said, I had some tools to work with, partial vision, et cetera. But it's been a challenge at times for sure.
I'm Ethan Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Steve Foresti, who's a senior advisor investments at Wilshire, where he's spent almost 30 years. He previously held a role as chief investment officer, among other roles. Welcome, Steve. Thanks for joining me today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with your background. Can you talk about where you grew up, what you studied, and how you ended up pursuing a role in the investment world?
Sure. I was born in New York City and Manhattan and grew up in its northern suburbs. So I guess from a geographic perspective, at least I was, the world of Wall Street seemed to be a constant presence. That said, I didn't have any direct exposure to that world. My parents were both Italian immigrants. My mom came over with her family when she was a young teenager and then had a career as a public school teacher. She was a foreign language teacher at White Plains High School, principally taught Italian, but a little bit of French and some Spanish earlier in her career. My father didn't come over to the States until he was in his mid-30s, and that was essentially to marry my mom. And in the States, his career was on the bakery floor at Stella d'Oro, which is an Italian cookie company based in the Bronx. So growing up, I was a decent student. I was mainly interested and focused on sports, but I did come to realize that I had an interest in math and seemed to have a knack at it. I attended Lehigh University, didn't know exactly what I wanted to pursue at that point, but after taking some freshman classes, kind of confirmed for me that I did have an interest in investing and pursued a finance degree. And when I graduated from Lehigh, I just returned to New York and fired out, what felt like dozens and dozens and dozens of resumes and landed a job at Dean Witter down in the financial district. Actually worked in Tower 2 of the World Trade Center. And it was within the Intercapital Group, which was the mutual fund arm of Dean Witter. It wasn't a very prestigious job. I was on a call center. Didn't particularly pay well, but it was an awesome entry-level position. No alternative funds back then, but Dean Witter had a broad array of equity and fixed income funds. So great exposure to the capital markets, learned a lot about different pockets of the equity market, from US investments to non-US investments, up and down the cap spectrum, growth, value. And they didn't call it this at the time, but even some alternative weighted schemes. And same thing in fixed income, different sectors, government's credit, different duration targets, et cetera. So great introduction to the capital markets. And then secondly, just awesome experience in terms of client service. The callers for this were both retail investors in the mutual funds, as well as Dean Witter's brokers. So you can just imagine the vast array of knowledge levels of people that we'd be talking to, and also personalities. So, learning to communicate effectively, not only, understand the question was being asked, but communicating and understanding the person and their level of background they had was really important. After a couple of years of doing that, I felt like my learning curve was really starting to flatten out and I needed to move on. And kind of assessing the situation, I thought I had a lot more to learn, and I could best do that by going to graduate school. Wanted to keep the expense down. So I looked at it was the top 25 business schools at the time, but focused in on the state schools. So that drew me to University of Texas at Austin, which was just a phenomenal 2 years there. I think I went through a big growth spurt. In addition to the coursework, the two things that came out of that for me was it's where I really started to learn how to use computers. I mean, it sounds funny now with how computers are everywhere in our daily lives, but it was at Texas that I purchased and used my first computer. I was lucky enough to have a roommate, Scott Greenstone, who was a fraternity brother of mine from back at Lehigh and a good friend of mine from our early days in New York. He was an early user of computers. So I was fortunate in that it's almost like I had a computer lab assistant as a roommate who really guided me through that. And the other thing I discovered was that I was a decent writer. And That was a big surprise because I had no need to do any writing when I was at Dean Witter. My experiences with writing, both at Lehigh and in grade school, they weren't great. It was an uncomfortable process. I didn't think I was particularly good at it. But just in terms of just doing group projects and taking the lead on some of those projects, got some good feedback. And it could be it could be the other students didn't want to put more work into it and were ready to just hand things in the way it was. But I took it as a little pat on the back that I was at least an adequate writer. I look back now and how much writing has been in my career. And I think a lot of that confidence started there in Texas.
And how about then after graduation? What was your next move?
When it came time to graduate, I had gotten engaged to my wife, Stacia, the second year there in Texas, and didn't have a job. So it was either back to New York or she was from Southern California. And I thought it'd probably be a safer move to not bring the Southern California girl to the change in weather in New York. So came out to the West Coast, looked for work, and that's when I started at Wilshire. It was October of 1994, and I got a job in the analytics group supporting the Wilshire Atlas product, working with asset owners, money managers, and just answering their questions, training them. But that kind of quickly became, from a client service focused job, it became more of a development job where not a coder by any means, but wrote the specs and, pushed evolution of these analytic tools forward. Worked a lot with quants. I'm not a quant myself. I kind of joke around that I'm a quant to be. I try to dig in, understand as much as I can. But I think the skill that I developed in those early days at Wilshire was to take a complex process, understand it pretty well, and then be able to break that down in a very practical way, both for educating clients and even doing internal training. It's something that I think has served me really well later in my career as well. But about 10 years into the Wilshire career, I had the opportunity to move into the consulting group. The woman I worked for at the time, Julia Bonifetti, had been tapped to lead the consulting group. There was some leadership changes at Wilshire. Steve Nesbitt, who ran the group for many, many years, had exited the firm, and Julia moved into that spot. And before it was announced, she called me and she told me what was happening. And she, told me she wanted me to move into the consulting group and to lead investment research process. And it was kind of an intimidating opportunity, but it came at a great time because, again, after 10 years of doing the analytics work, I was ready for a change, and this was a big one. But basically from there, it's been 20 years of me trying to contribute to thought leadership for Wilshire, both internally and across the industry. In 2015, I was named CIO of the consulting business unit. And then because of some structural changes, Wilshire moved from a business unit structure to a more functional structure back in 2021. So that title kind of shifted a bit to CIO of asset allocation, where I partnered up with Josh Emanuel, who at the time was CIO of funds management. And the two of us kind of led the investment platform. And then in early 2023, I stepped into a senior advisor role, which is what I'm doing now.
And then just in terms of your own unique characteristics. So can you talk about when you lost your sight and how that affected your work trajectory and your career at what stages?
Sure. Yeah. So my vision started to drop off at an early age. I was 7, basically in the second grade, and my mom just noticed when I was doing homework at the kitchen table that I was holding the book unusually close to my face, and kind of just did some ad hoc vision tests right there at the table, and quickly discovered that there was a bit of an issue, and that kind of kicked off a series of what became frantic doctor visits. Each time I went, let's say a week or two later, my vision had materially dropped off from the last time. And we finally got to the right specialist in New York City, who diagnosed me as having Stargardt disease, which is a form of macular degeneration. Effectively, it attacks your central vision. And he explained that, I would eventually, effectively lose my central vision, have a really hard time moving from dark to light or light to dark. And I'd never drive, eventually wouldn't be able to read, et cetera. So that was a bit of a challenge, but I will say it's like kind of pivot to how it affects my work career. I am lucky in the sense that I have partial vision. Things would be a lot worse for me if I didn't. So I'm able to, through my peripheral vision, for the most part, avoid bumping into people and walls and things. These days, having a little more trouble with that and miss a lot of steps when I'm walking around. But having partial vision is just a huge, huge benefit. And then I think the other place that I benefited was just from all the technology. I just imagine if I'd been born 50 years earlier, how much more challenging it would have been. But as far as using the computer, I use screen magnification and reader software. I mean, these days it's more of the reader side of that. than the screen mag because I just see such a small amount of the screen at a time that it's just very, very slow and cumbersome to move through things. But the reader, I mean, it's almost like my wife jokes sometimes when she, sees me at the computer that it's more like a download than actually like reading research papers. So the technology has been great. The iPhone, for example, I think normal sighted people couldn't even imagine the stuff that's just built in there as a default. And I interact with my phone with my ears and my voice. There's free apps. So anybody who has a vision problem that aren't aware of some of these things, there's an app called Seeing AI, which I use all the time. If I'm walking through an airport, there's the little applet in this thing where I can kind of point my phone around, just zoom it around, and it just will capture anything it sees and recognizes as text. So for example, if I'm trying to find a gate number, it'll just read off, gate 54, gate 53. It'll read documents. So the technology is something I lean on very, very heavily. Travel is obviously a problem. I will say there's another place I got lucky. Tracy Fleischer was a member of the Atlas team when I first joined Wilshire. On my first day, he drove me home from work. We discovered that he lived out further than me. I had mapped out 4 buses, 3.5-hour commute. And then he picked me up the next day. And on that second day, he just said, look, Steve, just stop worrying about figuring out your commute. I got you covered. And for 25 years, I kind of get a little emotional kind of thinking about it. But for 25 years, he basically gave me door-to-door service. And I just think about the hours that got me back, time with my family instead of sitting on a bus. So I've had some lucky breaks along the way for sure.
That's amazing. No, just amazing just to follow up, and what an extraordinary gesture and so impactful. And then in the work, because getting back to the story you told of your career before we asked that question, clearly Wilshire was a great home for you to find 30 years, I think, in some role or other there, navigating through. And obviously the technology you're describing today was not in place 30 years ago or so. So was there any challenge in finding a role or in the workplace search before you got there? And how did doing the job have to involve any modifications?
Yeah. When I first started using computers, the first window machine I got in Texas, there was some software that I was able to use. It's nothing like what I use today. But, I'll tell you, it was a struggle. When I got to Wilshire, they weren't running Windows machines. It was OS/2 because of the way that the products ran and the magnification software didn't work. My first 2 or 3 years at Wilshire, when I was using a computer, I held a handheld, it's a monocular, kind of one eyeball looking at the screen. And I just, I worked that way. But it was daunting. I mean, I'll be honest, when I went on interviews back then, the biggest thought in my mind was, oh, can I get away with people not realizing I have a disability? And it sounds terrible, and it makes me really think about disabled folks trying to move through different industries with that kind of obstacle in the way. But Wilshire's been great. It's been great. But yeah, you just make it work, whatever you need to do. But like I said, I had some tools to work with, partial vision, etc. But it's been a challenge at times for sure.
Just looking back at that 7-year-old you with a degenerating condition that seems like it was degenerating quite quickly, how do you think that shaped you in terms of whether it be dealing with adversity, resilience, uncertainty, that, because it's very young for those type of life skills to be laid down?
Honestly, I think you're somewhat isolated, protected when you're young. I think it was a bigger hit to my parents than to me. They were already kind of first generation parents trying to work their way through the world and raise 2 kids. But yeah, one of the things that the specialist told my mom, in addition to just describing how the disease would play out, was, he's going to struggle in school a bit. And you need to keep an eye on the school's tendency, not because they're malintended, but just because they don't have the resource and they don't know how to deal with somebody like Steve. They're going to very likely kind of drop him into slow learning classes. And, sure enough, like a year or 2 later, first day of school, you got, most of the kids in the kind of standard class. You've got some kids elevated to honors. And then you've got, kids that are allocated to the slower learning, need some extra attention. And that's where I landed. And my mom went charging in there. I guess she was prepared for this. And the school basically said, look, this is the assessment. It's all fine and good, but he's struggling and this will give him some extra time. And what the doctor told her was, he will become wherever they put him. And if you allow them to do that, then suddenly, this kid who has no cognitive issues will suddenly, identify himself that way. So she went off and got me privately tested, my mom, my dad. And they, we were not poor, but there wasn't a lot of discretionary money sitting around for private testing. But they did that and brought the results into the school and basically used that as more evidence that they had made a mistake and I should be in the, standard group. So they put me back in that standard group. without putting pressure on me, my mom said, okay, Steve, you know what you need to do now. You know what their inclinations are going to be. So you have to do your part. And I, learned to adapt. Can't see the chalkboard, have trouble reading stuff. And in a way, I'm lucky it happened when I was younger because I was able to adapt. I think, one of the lessons that I take from that is that I believe we're all capable of so much more than we know. And sometimes it takes a setback or adversity to learn that. So other challenges I've had in my life, I oftentimes think back to how different things would have been. And like if my parents had just sat back and let the school do what they were going to do, how different my life would have been. But it's adaptability, I think. I think we all can do so much more than we think we can.
A very salutary reminder, I think, when you do come across educators across the piece, really, of all kinds of disciplines who really have very high expectations for children. And they could be traditional educators, music teachers, performing arts. It's actually interesting how often children will rise to meet them. And I think that we should be reminded to keep the bar high simply because we can reach it, as you've just reminded us. So really extraordinary. And also that idea about you becoming where they place you, sadly, that is very true. And,
Yeah,
low
sure.
expectations are often quite a limiting factor. Clearly, your career then took off once you were in the door. And I'd love to talk a little bit about what was on your mind in Wilshire as CIO and now as senior advisor, given this is very much a field that overlaps with many of our subject matters, the field of consulting. What was at the forefront of the work you were doing as CIO and recently as senior advisor?
Yeah, so my focus, and I mentioned in the functional change that title of CIO of asset allocation. My focus has very much been on strategic asset allocation related capital market sort of topics. The shift into the senior advisor role was me just kind of coming out of COVID and just gaining so much perspective through that. I mean, it really did have a big impact on me, and just deciding that I was, when the world started opening up again, I wasn't ready to jump back on the treadmill and kind of head down and do what I was doing, and reached out to Jason Schwartz, who's my boss, the president of Wilshire, and, told him I was going to leave. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I was going to go do something else at some point, but I wanted to spend time with family and focus on other things. And this conversation was in March, and I told him, look, I'll give you anywhere from the minimum agreed time we have contractually up to until the end of the year. So almost a full 12 months for a transition. I'm not going anywhere. And Jason basically got back to me that same afternoon. He said, first off, end of the year, longer the transition, the better. And are you open to, is there a way we can structure something where you get the flexibility you're looking for, but you stay connected to the organization? A win for you, Steve, you get to stay connected to this interesting work. And, win for Wilshire, and that you're still contributing to what we're trying to create here and what we're trying to do for clients. And so I'm thankful for Jason for being creative, and we came up with that solution. So now I feel more productive than ever. I'm focused on, again, these big strategic topics. Top of mind stuff right now is just trying to convey this idea that I'm convinced of, that the next 10, 20, 30 years are going to look very, very different than the last 10, 20, 30 years. And trying to articulate that with clients, trying to present what some of the investment options are, and make the case that just the relationship between asset classes is likely to be very different, which means that the portfolios that have successfully navigated the last 20, 30 years are probably not going to be the optimal portfolios to take on the next 10 or 20 years. And I think this structure really allows me to dig into that and make the case. Other things I'm working on are, I still lead our capital market work, and I'm building out with some colleagues some climate transition risk regimes, just to try to understand how portfolios, depending on the path to an energy transition, where the vulnerabilities are across these different paths. So that's really interesting work, and important work to many of our clients.
And what do you think will look different about these portfolios? So I'm thinking they clearly weren't looking 60-40. I'm sure they had more endowment style, good diversification into alternatives. How do you think they will look different? Is it going to be radical change, like into Bitcoin? Is it going to be more synthetic exposures? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I'll disclose that I'm a big fan of Bitcoin. I'm not sure so much as a huge institutional asset, but I think it has interesting properties. And many of those properties are connected to what I think the environment looks like. So I think the big changes are around this idea of fiscal dominance, and how much debt that both in the US and the developed world more broadly has accumulated over the years, which is just a form of spending beyond your means. And at some point, to adjust for that, you have to spend below your means going forward. So the toolkit to governments in terms of dealing with future problems is going to be dramatically reduced. The idea of being able to throw money at all problems gets stressed when you're running at over 100% debt to GDP. So I do think, much broader than Bitcoin, inflation sensitive assets, broadly kind of characterized as real assets, should really be core assets within portfolios. I think, historically you can make the case they should have been core assets, but I think you can make an even stronger case going forward. I think you could just look to 2022 as just a little taste of what things might look like. And I'm not suggesting, 9% kind of inflation, but I do believe that inflation has been something that, anybody who's been in this industry for 20 or 30 years could have more or less ignored. And I don't think that's going to be the case in the future. So I think inflation sensitive assets built in a capital efficient and diversified way will be a really important part of future portfolios.
So interesting, just to pull a thread there on the discussion around digital assets, Bitcoin. This is somewhat of a vexed issue for some institutions. I think they see it as maybe gambling or without proven return characteristics or risk return characteristics, like, say, other asset classes. When you think about digital assets more broadly, how do you recommend institutions can exploit that? Would it be a certain percentage? Would it be in the asset itself, say in the Bitcoin or in an ETF attached to it? Would you look at some of the exchanges that are essentially the kind of picks and shovels behind it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to play it. I think what we've seen in terms of kind of in this institutional space is within kind of private market sleeves, venture capital sleeves and portfolios, and taking advantage of some of the infrastructure builds around digital assets. Where my interest is against the context of fiscal dominance is around the use of Bitcoin in particular as a form of digital gold. And its singular interesting property to me is its scarcity against the lack of scarcity in fiat money supply. And so the whole investment thesis over time would be you've got to get educated. You've got to kind of understand how the supply and demand dynamics work, particularly how the supply dynamics work in Bitcoin. But when you get comfortable with that, you quickly realize that this could be an asset because of its scarcity that grows in value simply because it's being measured in a currency that's being devalued and very likely systematically devalued through time for some of the reasons I talked about in terms of debt and deficits. But my view has been very specific to Bitcoin in very much a form of digital gold. And then I think if you think about allocations, they should be really small because you've got a highly volatile asset. I think Bitcoin could potentially play a role within this diversified set of real assets that I talked about, and at 50% plus kind of volatility. You don't need a lot of it to kind of add to that mix, that basket mix. But I think it's a thing that many institutions have already started to look at. Many more will, as you get this kind of growing track record of Bitcoin and people get much more comfortable with, again, the kind of supply demand and the creation process and the storage custodial issues around it. But I would be surprised if you don't see much greater adoption in the next 5 years than you see today in the institutional world.
Certainly a theme I'm hearing over and over again. So thank you for sharing that. It is a part-time role, my understanding. So what about the rest of your time? What is the next chapter looking like for you now as you explore this new chapter?
Well, I'm a year and a half into this. Jason and I kind of slightly adjusted our arrangement at the end of last year and kind of increased my commitment to Wilshire a little bit. But I've just enjoyed some family time, some travel. We've spent a lot of time up the coast in Central California. My kid who just graduated from college, there was a semester abroad that we were able to do a drop off and then go on some travel together there. So I'm just kind of starting to sketch that out, but I've nothing too exciting to report with that time in the first year other than just really trying to spend more quality time with family.
And how about some of the causes that are close to your heart? It seems that you do have quite an impassioned focus on ensuring better inclusion and perhaps that others have the opportunity that you had in terms of being able to flourish in a career.
Yeah, for sure. And we talked about it a little bit, but just through some networking opportunities I had in recent years, I've gotten more involved. And Chris Babcock of LSV, who I know you know, reached out to me a number of years ago. His daughter, Maddie, is blind, and he was just reaching out to successful people just to get feedback and suggestions and input. as he was helping Maddie guide her path. And he just gave me some of the stats on the employment numbers for, in this case, for the blind, but I think it's true just more broadly for disabled people. And it just gave me chills. And I don't mean it in a good way, because it reminded me of all of the kind of anxiety that I had, in looking for work and kind of moving my way through the ranks. So kind of in the early days, but through that, those networking opportunities have gotten more involved. I was introduced to Bob Lutke of the Harkin Institute and participated on some research he was doing about employment for disabled folks. He's put me in touch with some organizations. So I think the big thing for disabled people is you have a talent pool, which I think is so untapped, so eager to do valuable work, and so capable of doing that work. And you've got, I'll speak for my industry. I don't know about other industries, but you have positions that are completely accessible to somebody with whether it's somebody with a vision problem or hearing problem or somebody, in a wheelchair. These positions are accessible. They're largely computer jobs. They're looking for people to think and provide insights. So just need somebody to bridge that gap between this talent pool and these opportunities. So one example that I was introduced to is an organization called Making Space, Keely Catwells and Sophie Morgan, who basically do just that. They coordinate with corporations that have hiring needs, ongoing hiring needs. They recruit candidates. They train those candidates for the specific job that they'll be performing. And they basically provide that bridge. I think more things like that are kind of the solution to this issue. But as I get more interested and more involved, I would love to kind of amplify these kind of ideas and be more involved. And anyone listening who is part of an organization or knows an organization that has hiring needs, that this perks their curiosity, I'd say get in touch with them directly or reach out to me. I'd be happy to make an introduction.
Fascinating. I've made a lot of these podcasts, and actually the backdrop is so important. We've moved from this great resignation where hiring seemed to be on everyone's mind and a challenge to less of a great resignation. So unfortunately, then some of these initiatives take a backseat when the hiring strain is not. It should not, of course, take a backseat, but sadly it does. But I will definitely make sure that we amplify some of that work. When I move to the reflection section, usually we speak a bit about personal setbacks and challenges. Clearly, you started out with a setback that you worked throughout your life. In terms of looking career-wise, were there any in that throughout that long career at Wilshire or before, any setbacks or challenges that you learned lessons from and pivoted as a result?
Fortunately, career-wise, I haven't had too many setbacks. I mean, I've had them, but nothing significant, fortunately. From an investment standpoint, constant mistakes, constant learning. Fortunately, none of them have been big mistakes and always kind of diversified positioning. But like recent example would be, I talked about this whole idea of fiscal dominance. I feel like in this COVID environment, I got the first part pretty much right. I never believed in this idea of inflation being transitory. It didn't seem to make much sense to me, but I kind of missed the back end of it. And to be fair to myself, like many others, kind of expected an economic slowdown that hasn't really materialized. And as I look at it, I think that's just this changing world when you're on the fiscal side, spending 5% of GDP, deficit spending, that's going to be supportive of an economy. So that's kind of what's kind of put me on this path to really understand what else is going to be different, what other kind of mechanics work differently. But I think we talked about just the setbacks around vision earlier. I mean, that's obviously with the bigger ones and where the bigger lessons in my life were learned.
And how about key people? You've already mentioned people taking a significant role in your life to date, and particularly that colleague who drove you to and from work. Any key people who were mentors to you throughout your career that you can mention here?
Yeah, for sure. And obviously, I won't go through it again, but my parents, first and foremost, for everything that they provided and did for me. But as far as work, I guess, two people just immediately come to mind. I mentioned Julia, who gave me the opportunity in consulting. And when she, called me, I was pretty intimidated by moving into that position. And, without being, there's no hyperbole here. I basically was like, I better figure out what the difference is between a DC and a DB plan, and I better figure it out pretty quickly. And I said to her, I don't know, this could go horribly wrong. And, Julia said, look, Steve, your stuff, whatever you don't know, you're going to learn. Just get in there, meet the consultants, understand what their challenges and problems are, and then just do you, just try to be helpful. And, I did that and it worked out great. I met a great group of people, but her kind of giving me that push and that confidence went a long way. And then further, I mean, Julia was moving into a challenging position at the time. with lots of challenges, and just kind of watching her navigate that and kind of maintaining her balance and her kind of grace through that process was also something that I admired and kind of used as inspiration on how I want to kind of behave in a corporate world. And then the other would be Charlie Stunkard, who is a colleague of mine at Wilshire who retired a couple of years ago. And he was one of the people that I, got to know better when I moved into consulting. Charlie ran the Wilshire Compass product for many, many years, but later in his career was a senior consultant. And what I picked up from Charlie was just preparation. I thought I was prepared for things. You can imagine if you're, in my case, if I'm giving a presentation with 30 or whatever number of slides and I can't see a single word or number on any of the slides, just the preparation that has to go into memorizing stuff. What order do the slides come in? What numbers am I going to be talking about? So I was forced to prepare, probably more than most people. But when I met Charlie, I was like, wow, this guy, I was in meetings with him and he just knew stuff inside and out. And, number one, it was just a pleasure to go to a meeting with somebody like that who you knew had their part of the meeting tightened up and you could focus on, what you were there to do. But number two is kind of inspiring to just make sure that I'm not going to be going to any meetings, whether it's an internal or external meeting, without being, totally prepared. So I'm not the kind of person who shows up at a meeting and basically starts by saying, what are we talking about? I kind of come in knowing what the agenda is and kind of do my prep work. So those would be the two I call out, but there's been so many great people I've worked with at Wilshire over the years, but those two in particular come to mind.
And my final question is around any words of wisdom. I think we all know to prepare and also to expect a lot of people, that they can rise to the occasion. I've certainly taken those away. Anything maybe that you would advise your younger self, the young student at Lehigh, or that you now have consolidated as a creed or motto of your own?
Yeah, the advice would be, and I hope I'd be strong enough to take the advice, would be to put yourself in uncomfortable situations. I think as I look back at my life, all the growth, all of the great things that happened by oftentimes putting yourself in an uncomfortable, difficult situation and learning from that situation. It's easy to take the path of least resistance. Like for me, going to a conference or going to a meeting when I can't see anybody's face and it could be awkward, socially awkward, is daunting. And I will say every time I've pushed myself to do that and kind of gotten over the anxiety of it has been great. I can't think of a single time where at the end of the day, and I'm kind of putting my head down at the end of the day, where I didn't think, oh, I'm really glad I did that. So I guess that would be the advice, which would just be get uncomfortable. You're going to learn from it, and almost nothing but good things will come out of it. You do have to take a little bit of risk. There is a chance things can go wrong, but it's such a worthwhile way to just push yourself through life.
Fantastic advice. And yes, the comfort zone and getting outside it. Yeah, I've heard it described as both where the terror and the magic happens. Well, thank you so much, Steve. You are an inspiration in terms of having a very long and productive investment career, and also being able to now ensure that you give back and ensure that the next generation, whether they need accommodations or not, can flourish in our profession, which I think is one of the most satisfying ones. So thank you so much for coming here and sharing your insights with us.
Well, thank you. This has been fun, and it's not stuff I often discuss so openly. So I want to thank you for the platform and for making it so comfortable.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find all of our content on the 50 Faces Hub, where you'll find a library of role models, resources, and other solutions to enhance your career.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.